Welcome to the Connected Enterprise Podcast. This is Carl Lewis, your host from Vision33, and my guest today is Blake Burch, who is a co-founder of Shipyard. Blake, welcome to the podcast. Start us off by telling us about yourself and about Shipyard.
So I'm Blake Burch. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Shipyard, and we are a modern data orchestration platform that helps data teams be able to connect tools together, be able to move data between those tools, and be able to verify that data is consistently being delivered. And if any sort of issues happen, that they get notification and alerts and have some sort of observability into everything that's going on under the hood.
Very interesting stuff. You specialize in helping people use their data
Yeah.
and analyze it, make sense out of it, drive automations as a result of this data.
I would say like
What-
a few examples of that so your listeners know what we typically work or deal with is that it's usually going to be all about deliver data to stakeholders. So whether you're trying to get something out of a file storage system like Google Drive or Box or Dropbox and deliver it, or you're trying to get data out of a warehouse like Snowflake or BigQuery, or maybe it's even living in like a Sheets database, Google Sheets, Smart Sheets, Notion, something else like that. We help people deliver data that way very easily with our low code templates that we have built in place. But we also see people using it to build out like proactive alerts. So it could be things like being able to let the sales team know when a like high priority lead like recently came back to the site or made some sort of activity that seems like it could be very valuable. You can set up Slack or email alerts off that. You can let the data team know when there are actively data issues. You could make sure that the HR team knows when someone maybe hasn't filled out a survey internally. There's lots of different use cases, but it's really trying to figure out how to get people aware of what they can use their data for.
It seems like people reach a certain point where whatever systems they're using, like you just described several that might be there. It is amazing still in today's world how many people still have data in sheets. I just talked to a company a couple of weeks ago that just now put in their ERP system. They were running the entire company for like the last 20 years, all on spreadsheets.
It is
That
crazy.
that really boggles my mind that people can still do that and to think about the amount of effort that goes into that.
Mhm.
But others have been on ERP systems for 20 years, and their databases have grown quite large. They get a little cumbersome, not as productive as they once were, and transactions slow down and things of this nature.
Mhm.
So they talk about, using some of the other solutions you talked about, the data warehousing solutions like Snowflake, I forget the other one that you mentioned,
BigQuery.
BigQuery. Help us to understand, what are these data warehousing systems?
The way that I like to think about it is that there's been a recent rise in what are called cloud data warehouses. Not necessarily like the best term because there's still other types of databases like MySQL, SQL Server, Postgres, and stuff like that that can be in the cloud. The real differentiator between some of these new databases that you see popping up is that they primarily are serving as analytical databases. So something that anyone on the team can actively like query to try insights out of the data rather than something that is necessarily like transactional to make the system work, to update permissions, to like update records of how much inventory you should have left or anything else like that. And when it comes to these like analytical databases that are living in the cloud, the big thing that they do that makes it really easy to manage is that they're scaling things up and down based on the query load automatically. So oftentimes for like traditional data warehouses, you might have to be in a situation where you are actively managing the servers themselves. So you're provisioning new servers because you ran out of CPU capacity or you have too much data in there in the storage. So now you have to split it up across multiple systems and then say, well, this query needs to access data in this system and this other query needs to access data in another system. And they completely abstract that away so that you can just throw as many queries as you want at it and it's just automatically going to scale it up and down. Like I think they have some insane stat and don't hold me to the quote here, but I think it's like 1 terabyte of data can be processed in like 10 seconds on something like BigQuery, and that's unfathomable in a lot of these other platforms. That's oftentimes what we see people using if they're just trying to handle big workloads and not really have to worry about who's querying it when, at what time, and how much data is being processed.
What kind of data do companies put in a data warehouse?
Everything under the sun that relates to your business. Throwing out some examples, like if you're using support tools, a intercom or a Zendesk, like ticketing systems, having all of that information about all the tickets that customers have had with you over time, being able to analyze that data, that's something that can live in there. Marketing platforms like Google Ads, Bing Ads, working with programmatic providers like Trade Desk, working with Facebook and Meta and all of those folks over there. All of that data is something that you could have in a warehouse to be able to analyze. And my background, I used to work a lot with different sort of product feeds. Retailers that I worked with had hundreds of thousands of products, and being able to have like live inventory data for every single hour, effectively, like what was the stock of every single item and what's the description associated to that, what's the category associated to that, that information can live there. And there's so many different examples that you could have there, but the real goal is to make a data warehouse kind of your central source of truth. Doesn't matter where the data is coming from, what aspect of the business it relates to, it should live in one single roof.
Would it be proper to think of the data warehouse as history, not
Yeah.
necessarily transactions that are happening now, but history?
In a way, a lot of it is all about the history, how things performed, what they look like over time.
Do you have any examples of companies that have kind of reached this critical mass point where they need a data warehouse? Are there triggers that sort of drive that decision to this is what we need to do?
From my perspective, and a lot of the customers that I end up working with, I feel like that's almost one of the first things that should come into play, especially if you're starting a new business from scratch nowadays. I find that before customers have a data warehouse, what they're typically doing is relying on exactly what you said earlier, where it's a bunch of disparate systems that you're having to log into to try and like pull analytic numbers for like internal reports, or it's a bunch of spreadsheets where that data is being copied and pasted into a single sheet and then aggregated all in another sheet. We see that pretty commonly on our side. It's a real sign that you're probably not doing things in the best way possible, in the most efficient way possible. And if you're over relying on multiple different files or multiple different sheets, it should probably live in a database. I think the thing is, it's just difficult to overcome that and try and figure out like when is that tipping point of okay, this is probably bad. I should set up a system to make sure this data is dumped into a warehouse instead of relying on my brittle sheet-based system.
Exactly. You mentioned that you can put almost anything into this data warehouse that you think has value and you might want to look at the history of.
Mhm.
But a lot of these programs, disparate systems, they'll have a different structure one from another. So how does a data warehouse overcome that issue where, let's say I've got information from my ERP system, information from Salesforce, information from a website, I've got Zendesk, and I want to put it all in one place. How does it get structured so that that's not just a mess?
In general, what you have to think about is the general way in which you want to build out your data warehouse. I typically recommend as you're creating tables where the data is going to live and that you can access, what is a consistent naming system that you can use in order to be able to access the data? So, like a very simple example is being able to name your tables related to the department and then maybe some sort of separator like an underscore, and then relate it to the tool, and then after that relate it to the level of granularity of data that you're getting. So for example, on Salesforce, it might be sales underscore Salesforce underscore, and then you have contacts and you have deals and you have companies. And so you have to try and think about like every single report that you might want to pull from that system, where does that live? And then wherever you make it live, it's just a matter of determining what pieces of information are actually valuable there. So when it comes to Salesforce, there's hundreds of fields that you could have that are related to a company, but which of those are actually going to drive business value? Which are you going to need to do analytics on? Some people operate on a dump it all philosophy, which is fine, but it just makes it overwhelming. So sometimes it's nice to critically assess, am I actually going to use this data for some analysis? And if not, is it worth storing the history of it? Because the more data you store the history of, the more costly it's going to get over time. I would
Yeah.
say that's the general structure I would follow and
Mhm.
think about.
I want to come back to that question a little bit. It's intriguing to me, and I'm sure others too. You're definitely an advocate for cloud based systems,
Yeah.
although, as we both know, people do some of this on premises as well.
Mhm.
But why do you believe the cloud based systems are really the smart choice now?
They can also be the expensive choice, and I like to be cognizant of that because I never want to just say like this is the absolute best thing for your business. I am
Mhm.
not in the weeds of what someone else's business is, and it could be a different choice. But I think a lot of the times it saves you the human capital that it costs to maintain a lot of the systems that power your warehouse. It ultimately gets you into a spot where your team has the ability to service themselves and analyze the data and like apply multiple different filters and have multiple different queries running where you're not having to worry about, do I have the capacity for them to be able to actively use the data? You're basically just able to give them a free pass that says, here is the data that's available, and your analysts can query it directly via SQL. Your business users can like query it using like drag and drop filters and business intelligence tools like Tableau or ThoughtSpot or anything else like that. I feel like that's really the reason why it gets rid of the human capital there. And the other part is speed. Ultimately, nobody wants to be sitting around waiting for a query to finish running 10 hours later. I know there's a lot of legacy systems where the data can get so bogged down that you can't get the answers you need as a business. And what usually happens is that someone accidentally didn't like query the right thing. One little filter was off. And so you waited 10 hours for the wrong answer. And now you have to wait 10 hours again. So having a cloud warehouse just really avoids those types of issues.
We're definitely in the SaaS mode at this point. Are a lot of these tools also SaaS cloud driven that people would use to do analysis on the data?
Yeah. So a lot of the tools that I've mentioned so far are effectively SaaS-based tools. And that's usually what I'm most familiar with because that's the type of tools that we typically build out integrations for ourselves over at Shipyard.
We were talking about it a little bit. You used the phrase, yeah, you could dump everything into it, but maybe it sounds like a more intelligent approach would be smart
Yeah.
if someone can bring themselves to think that hard about it.
The way that
Uh,
I like to think about it there is it's better than just dumping all the data to think of what is the business problem I'm trying to solve and then backing into it and trying to figure out what is the bare minimum of information that I need in order to solve this problem. And so when you were asking about like how do you make sure that you structure this data when it's so different between each of these tools, you have to try and figure out how can I marry that data together? Like what is going to be a common factor? So for things like your CRM system, it's going to be like email typically. But for other systems, you have to try and figure out, can I like map people up based on IP addresses, on like addresses, customer IDs, and just making sure that there's some sort of unifying element so that data between these two different systems can actively be mapped up.
some concept of master data needs to come into place that's
Yeah.
going to help you relate all this information from all these different systems,
Yeah.
whether that's customer ID, vendor ID, something like that, that gives you some relational capabilities that are there. Because I can think of a scenario where, let's just say, invoice information in the ERP system that might involve 15 tables for all these various things, but I might not really care about all the addresses that we ship to,
Right.
but I might care about the inventory item, the quantity, its description, and the date it was purchased. And it's probably a smaller set of data that would make my data warehouse operate better also if
Yeah.
I don't conglomerate it too much. Maybe I want a data warehouse where I just throw everything so that
Yeah.
I've got a copy of everything just in case. But maybe I also want one where that's a little more thoughtful in that way. That's one of the reasons that like ERP systems that our customers run become frustrating for reporting is because there's just everything there. Trying to get an understanding of those 15 to 2,000 tables and the hundreds of fields in each table is fairly overwhelming if you're not a consultant working in that application all the time.
I think people have a little bit of FOMO or the fear of missing out, right? If I don't store this data, what
Yeah.
happens if I do eventually need it? And it's like, well, when you do need it, then you can start storing it and then analyzing it. It's not worth getting yourself into a state where everything is overwhelming because you've stored everything and you've been paying for it. There were actually
Yeah.
some studies that were released recently, and I'm going to butcher the numbers, so take that with a grain of salt, but it was effectively like I think 90% of companies only actually end up using data that is within the last 6 months or something like that. Like, you can use things for year-over-year reporting and stuff, but most queries and analysis and things that are being done are oftentimes on much more recent data and on much smaller sets of data than are actually ever stored.
For sure. Let's say a company's determined they're a good fit for data warehousing, right?
Mhm.
What are some places they can go to get started? What are some recommendations you might make for here's a warehousing tool you should take a look at?
I would strongly recommend the two that I've talked about, Snowflake and BigQuery. They are really easy to get started with. You can sign up for an account and start using it immediately. Both of them have like usage-based pricing. I think it differs between them, but it's usually based off of the quantity of data that you're actively processing or the amount of time that servers are up and running against your queries. And they're relatively approachable to just get data into. The act of having a warehouse that is available is extremely easy with the cloud data warehouses. What's a little bit more difficult is just getting the data into those systems. And so I would recommend if you're trying to find something where you don't know how to code and you just want to get access to this data and have it dumped into a system, there are tools like Portable, there are tools like Fivetran or Stitch or Airbyte. I'm listing a bunch because ultimately what matters is, can they dump the data that I have in my system into that warehouse? Almost all of them support the warehouses that I mentioned, but they don't all support the same tools. And so sometimes you
Right.
just mix and match to get the data where you need it to go.
So those are tools to get the data from your system into the warehouse.
Yep.
Are there other, call them basic analytical tools that for non-programmer types you would recommend?
For non-programmer types, I would recommend, in terms of business intelligence and being able to actually display the data and see it on your side, a great free option is always the Google, I think it's Looker Data Studio now is what their new brand is. But there's always tools like Power BI or Tableau you can use to access data in those warehouses and start building out reports and verify how things look. So those kind of like take advantage of the two opposite spectrums. One is tools that load the data in, and the other one is letting you look at the data that is actively in there. I think there's another important part there, which is just trying to make sure that data is consistently running through the system and that you can like build alerts and everything off of it, which is going to be like the orchestration aspect that we focus on our side at Shipyard.
You have these tools to take the data from one system, put them into the warehouse, but is that something that you do periodically or is it in real time? How does that get handled?
I think it just depends on the frequency of your business. You'll see plenty of articles out there that are like, why real time is the way to go. But real time only makes sense for things where the information has to be up to date in that moment. So I would say that probably for e-commerce situations where you're going to be handling like thousands of orders per second, yeah, that's got to be real time. A ticketing system like for Taylor Swift's concert tickets, that's got to be real time because people need to know if
Yeah,
they can get a
that
ticket.
needs to be like real time times 10, I think, something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. But I would say the majority of businesses can usually deal with some sort of batch processing. And again, we have to think of it in terms of analytical database versus a transactional database.
Right.
Transactional needs to be as close to real time as possible, but analytical, it's okay if it's delayed by 3 hours, 6 hours, 12. Like most brands that I work with still are only doing things on a daily basis. It's just really a question of, are you going to get any insight out of that data that you can react to fast enough to warrant getting real-time database? And if you can't answer that question, then it's okay to do batch processing on
Right.
a daily basis.
Businesses who are thinking about this are going to ask, do I have anybody who can get value out of this for me? What are the skills, the basic skills that if you're going down this road, I got to have somebody on my staff who has these basic skills? What are they?
I think the most basic skill that you need to get the most value out of your data is just being able to read and write SQL. That's going to be the language of most databases. Each is going to have their own unique little flavor of it and like slight
Yep.
nuances. I found myself at my previous job, I taught a lot of people how to read and write SQL, and I just compared it to Excel formulas. It's not too different. It's not overly complicated. I think it can
Yep.
seem scary to some folks, but you can self-teach some of that stuff. If there's a will, there's a way. It's not too hard of a way to figure out. But SQL is going to be the most important to make sure that you can access that data. I would say secondarily though, having some sort of Python knowledge. SQL is going to be great for getting the data out, for analyzing it, for trying to understand what it means. If you ever want to do anything with it and react to it and have that data direct some other system to do some specific thing if it like reaches a certain threshold. That's when you're going to need to know Python to figure out how to work with these external systems and make those sort of calls.
That's good to know. That means I'm not a candidate. I could probably do a lot of my own queries, but
Yep.
Python, no, don't give me that job.
Right. And that's mostly if you're trying to do like super technical things, and also like any of the tools that I mentioned that are ingesting data. Like if you have a tool that isn't like natively supported, then you'll probably be in a situation where you have to like write a script to grab that data and automate it on some sort of orchestration platform. But I would say that for the majority of tools and the majority of businesses, you could probably get away without any of those skills that I just mentioned. Just being able to have these like point and click solutions that you're using to analyze the data, you just won't be able to go as deep with it as you might if you had those skills.
So solutions like Tableau and Microsoft
Uh,
Solution, Power BI,
yeah, Power BI.
they have connectors to most data
Yep.
warehouse systems. So
Yes, they
so
do.
they're
And
kind
you
of
don't
built
have to
in.
know SQL to use them.
Right, right. You just have to be able to point to the right thing.
Yep.
That's all good information. We have a set of customers that have been running our ERP system now for 20 years, if you can
hmm
believe that. Their databases grow over time. Sometimes they get a little unwieldy, and data warehousing is at least something they should think about. This was good information to know that there are folks out there like yourself that they specialize in helping companies get the most out of this data.
hmm
And we live in a world where everybody wants to keep all the data forever, recognize its value. I mean, everybody is building their own library of Alexandria. That's the way I think of it. So,
Yep.
yeah, data is power and data is revenue. They hang on. Well, thank you, Blake. I appreciate your being with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for having me.
You're welcome. And for everyone else, we'll see you again on the next episode of the Connected Enterprise Podcast. Stay connected.